The December air was cold and crisp as Lieutenant David Cooper drove through the quiet streets of Pinewood Heights. Christmas lights twinkled from nearby houses and the smell of wood smoke drifted through his slightly cracked window. He was heading to the community center where he'd been invited to speak to local teenagers about military service and leadership. David had just returned from deployment 3 weeks ago. After spending months overseas, everything back home felt almost surreal. The peaceful suburban streets, the holiday decorations, the simple act of driving without worrying about roadside threats. It all felt like a luxury he'd forgotten existed. His dress uniform hung carefully in the back seat, wrapped in plastic to keep it pristine. He'd worn it earlier that day for a ceremony at the VA hospital, where he'd visited wounded veterans. Now he was just in jeans and a hoodie, looking forward to grabbing a coffee before his speaking engagement. David wasn't speeding. He knew he wasn't. His cruise control was set at exactly 28 miles per hour in the 30 zone. It was a habit from his military training. Follow the rules. Stay disciplined. Never give anyone a reason to question you. That's why his heart sank when he saw the red and blue lights flash behind him. He glanced at his speedometer again. Still 28. He checked his rear-view mirror to make sure both taillights were working. They were. His registration was current. His inspection sticker was valid. He ran through a mental checklist trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. With a deep breath, David put on his turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road. He positioned his car carefully, making sure he was well out of the traffic lane. Old habits from his father's teaching kicked in automatically. He rolled down his window despite the cold. He turned off the radio. He placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, clearly visible. These weren't things he'd learned in the Army. These were lessons from a different kind of survival training. The kind his father had given him when he turned 16 and got his first driver's license. "Son," his father had said, "when you get pulled over, and you will get pulled over, you do exactly what I tell you. Hands on the wheel, window down, no sudden movements. Say yes, sir, and no, sir, even if you want to scream. Your goal is to get home alive. Your pride can wait." David had been confused back then. He'd asked why he needed special instructions that his white friends didn't seem to worry about. His father had just looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Because the world doesn't always see you the way I see you." Now, sitting on the side of the road, David understood. In his rearview mirror, he watched the officer approach. The man moved slowly, one hand resting on his duty belt near his weapon. David kept his hands visible, forcing himself to breathe steadily. He'd faced armed insurgents overseas. He'd led men through combat zones. But somehow this moment felt just as dangerous. The officer reached his window and leaned down. David could see his nameplate. "Officer Mitchell." The man's face was hard, his jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the inside of David's car with obvious suspicion. "License and registration," Officer Mitchell said. Not asked, demanded. No explanation for the stop. No polite greeting. "Yes, sir," David replied calmly. "My license is in my wallet in my right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now if that's okay." Officer Mitchell's hand moved closer to his weapon. Slowly. David moved with deliberate care, announcing each action. "I'm reaching for my wallet now." He pulled it out, extracted his license, and held it up where the officer could see it. Then he reached toward the glove compartment. "Now I'm opening the glove box for my registration." The glove compartment popped open, revealing his military ID sitting on top of his registration papers. David pulled both out and handed them through the window, along with his driver's license. Officer Mitchell barely glanced at the documents. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on David's face, then darted to the back seat where the dress uniform hung. "Whose car is this?" Mitchell asked. "It's mine, sir," David replied, confused by the question. "You sure about that?" David felt a knot forming in his stomach. "Yes, sir. I'm sure. It's registered in my name." Officer Mitchell straightened up, studying the registration with exaggerated skepticism. "Step out of the vehicle." "Can I ask what I did wrong, sir?" "I said step out of the vehicle." The officer's voice had an edge now, sharp, threatening. David complied. He opened the door slowly and stepped onto the cold pavement. At 6 feet tall, he was in excellent shape from years of military fitness training, but he tried to make himself seem smaller, less threatening. He knew how this worked. He'd seen the videos. He'd heard the stories. He'd lived through versions of this before, though never quite this tense. Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Sir, I'm a military officer. I'm a lieutenant in the United States Army. I've done nothing wrong. David kept his voice respectful, but tried to assert some basic dignity. Officer Mitchell laughed. It wasn't a friendly sound. Sure you are. And I'm the president. Turn around, now. David did as ordered, placing his hands on the cold metal of his car. He felt Officer Mitchell's hands roughly patting him down, far more aggressively than necessary. The search was thorough to the point of being humiliating. Other cars drove past, their occupants staring at the scene. What's with the uniform in the back? Mitchell asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. It's mine. I wore it earlier today for a ceremony. Really? Where'd you get it? Costume shop. The insult stung, but David kept his voice level. No, sir, I earned it. I'm stationed at Fort Bragg. I just returned from deployment. Officer Mitchell walked to the back door and opened it, pulling out the uniform without permission. He examined it like he was looking for evidence of a crime. David's medals and ribbons were pinned to the chest. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Multiple service ribbons earned through years of dedication and sacrifice. These real? Mitchell asked, his tone suggesting he already believed they weren't. Yes, sir. All of them. A few neighbors had come out of their houses now, attracted by the commotion. An elderly man stood on his porch watching. A woman across the street had her phone out. David didn't know if she was recording, but he hoped she was. Officer Mitchell tossed the uniform back into the car carelessly. It fell onto the floor, and David had to fight the urge to react. That uniform represented everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed for, and this officer was treating it like garbage. You got anything illegal in this car? Mitchell demanded. No, sir. You sure about that? No drugs, no weapons? I'm certain, sir. Mitchell walked around the car slowly, looking in the windows, clearly searching for any excuse to escalate the situation further. David stood still, hands still on his vehicle, watching his breath form clouds in the cold air. His phone was buzzing in his pocket. Probably his fiancée wondering why he was late, but he didn't dare reach for it. Where are you coming from? Mitchell asked. The VA hospital. I was visiting wounded veterans. Where are you going? The community center on Oak Street. I'm speaking to students there. Mitchell stopped pacing and faced David directly. You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Description of what, sir? Don't worry about it. David's military training told him to stay calm. His instincts told him something was very wrong. This wasn't a normal traffic stop. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous, and it was about to get much worse. The temperature seemed to drop even further, or maybe it was just the ice running through David's veins. He stood there, hands still pressed against his car, trying to process what Officer Mitchell had just said. He fit a description. But what description? Of who? For what crime? Sir, can you tell me what description I match? David asked, keeping his voice as steady as possible. I have a right to know why I'm being detained. Mitchell's face hardened. You don't have the right to question me. You understand that? When I tell you something, you listen. David had led soldiers through dangerous situations overseas. He'd been trained to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. In combat, you knew who the enemy was. You had rules of engagement. You had backup. Here on a quiet suburban street in his own country, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in a war zone. I'm not questioning you, sir, David said carefully. I just want to understand the situation. The situation is that you need to shut up and do what you're told. More neighbors had gathered now. David could see them in his peripheral vision. An older woman with gray hair stood on the sidewalk, her hand covering her mouth. A middle-aged man in a business suit had stopped jogging and was watching from across the street. A younger woman stood on her porch, her phone definitely pointed in their direction. Mitchell noticed the growing audience too, and it seemed to make him angrier rather than more cautious. Everyone get back inside, he yelled toward the onlookers. This is police business. Nobody moved. The woman with the phone actually took a step closer. Mitchell turned back to David and his hand moved to his service weapon. Not drawing it yet, but resting his palm on the grip. It was a gesture meant to intimidate, and it worked. Turn around, Mitchell ordered. Face me. David complied slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. He kept his hands visible, raised slightly at shoulder height. This was the position he'd seen in too many videos that ended badly. I'm going to search your vehicle, Mitchell announced. Do you have probable cause? David asked, immediately regretting the question. Mitchell's eyes flashed with anger. What did I tell you about questioning me? You think because you're wearing fancy clothes and driving a nice car that you're better than me? You think you can just come into this neighborhood and do whatever you want? I live 20 minutes from here, David said quietly. I'm not doing anything wrong. We'll see about that. Mitchell walked to the driver's side door and began searching through David's car. He pulled out the gym bag from the passenger seat, dumping its contents onto the ground. Workout clothes, a towel, a water bottle, and protein bars scattered across the cold pavement. David watched helplessly as the officer rifled through his belongings. He opened the center console, pulled out papers, tossed them aside. He checked under the seats, in the door pockets, everywhere. The search was thorough and deliberately disrespectful. Please, be careful with my uniform, David said when Mitchell reached for it again. I'll handle it however I want to handle it. Mitchell pulled the uniform out completely this time, shaking it as if something might fall out. When nothing did, he dropped it on the hood of the car. David's jaw clenched. That uniform represented years of service, blood, sweat, and sacrifice, and this officer was treating it like trash. The man who had been jogging walked closer, his phone now out as well. Officer, this seems excessive, he called out. What did he do? Mitchell spun around, his face red. I told you to back off. This is your last warning. I'm just standing on a public sidewalk, the jogger replied calmly. I have every right to be here. David appreciated the support, but he was also terrified. He didn't want anyone else to become a target of Mitchell's aggression. Things were already spiraling out of control, and he had no idea how to de-escalate the situation. Mitchell returned his attention to David, stepping uncomfortably close. David could smell coffee on his breath, could see the veins bulging in his neck. You people think you're so smart, Mitchell said, his voice low and venomous. Coming into neighborhoods where you don't belong, driving cars you probably can't afford, acting like you own the place. There it was. The truth behind the traffic stop. This had nothing to do with matching a description or broken taillights or any legitimate police work. This was about the color of David's skin. This was about an officer who saw a young black man in a nice car and decided that was reason enough to stop him. I served this country for 8 years, David said, fighting to keep his voice from shaking. I've earned everything I have. I deserve to be treated with respect. You don't tell me what you deserve, Mitchell shouted, and suddenly his weapon was out of its holster, pointed directly at David's chest. Time seemed to stop. David heard gasps from the onlookers. Someone screamed. But all he could focus on was the barrel of that gun, pointed at his heart from less than 6 feet away. He'd been shot at before. In Afghanistan, insurgents had ambushed his convoy. Bullets had pinged off the armored vehicle he was in. He'd returned fire, protected his men, completed the mission. He'd been trained for that, prepared for it, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Standing unarmed on an American street wearing civilian clothes, having a police officer point a loaded weapon at him for no legitimate reason. Hands up! Higher! Mitchell screamed. David's hands were already raised, but he lifted them higher, stretching them toward the darkening sky. His military training kicked in, the same composure that had kept him alive in combat zones. Don't make sudden moves. Stay calm, survive. I'm not a threat, David said, his voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through him. I'm complying with everything you've asked. Please lower your weapon. You don't tell me what to do. The woman on the porch was openly filming now, and she shouted toward them. I'm recording this. Everyone can see what you're doing. Mitchell didn't seem to care. Or maybe he was too far gone in his rage to think clearly. His finger rested on the trigger guard, and David knew that one wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, could end his life. I'm an Army lieutenant, David said again, hoping the words might break through somehow. I have commendations for valor. I've served honorably. I'm not your enemy. Shut up about your military service. You probably stole that uniform anyway. The insult burned, but David couldn't afford to react. He kept his hands high, his body still, his face as neutral as possible. He thought about his fiancée, who would be worried now. He thought about his parents, who had warned him about moments like this. He thought about the speech he was supposed to give to those teenagers about honor and service and believing in your country. What would he tell them now? That you could do everything right and still end up with a gun pointed at you? That your service and sacrifice meant nothing to someone who had already decided what you were based on the color of your skin? More cars had stopped now. Traffic was backing up. More phones were out. More witnesses to this surreal nightmare. David heard someone call 911, reporting an officer with his weapon drawn on an unarmed man. Mitchell seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. His hand trembled slightly, and David didn't know if that made things better or worse. A scared officer with a gun was just as dangerous as an angry one. "You're all recording me?" Mitchell yelled at the crowd. "You think I care?" This suspect was being aggressive. He was reaching for something. David's hands were still above his head. He hadn't reached for anything. Everyone there knew it. The cameras knew it. The truth was captured in digital evidence that couldn't be denied. But in that moment, with a gun pointed at his chest and an officer willing to lie about what was happening, David understood something terrible. The truth might not matter. The evidence might not matter. Nothing might matter except whether he survived the next few minutes. "Please," David said quietly. "I have a family.
I have a fiancé."
I'm not who you think I am." Mitchell's hand steadied on the weapon. His eyes were cold now, calculating, and David realized with horror that this officer was actually considering whether to pull the trigger. The standoff felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only seconds. David kept his hands raised, his eyes locked on Officer Mitchell's face, trying to read what would happen next. The gun stayed pointed at his chest, unwavering. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife, came the sound of another police siren. A second patrol car pulled up behind Mitchell's vehicle, lights flashing. David felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe this nightmare would end now. Maybe someone with sense would take control of the situation. A female officer stepped out of the newly arrived car. She was older, maybe in her 40s, with sergeant stripes on her uniform. The moment she saw Mitchell with his weapon drawn, her expression changed to shock and concern. "Mitchell, what's going on here?" She called out, approaching quickly but carefully. "This suspect was being aggressive, Sergeant Torres," Mitchell said, his voice suddenly different, more controlled, professional, like he was reading from a script he'd prepared. He matched the description from the convenience store robbery. When I attempted to question him, he became hostile and reached toward his waistband. David's mouth fell open. "That's not true. I never reached for anything. My hands have been visible the entire time." "He's lying," the woman from the porch shouted, holding up her phone. "I recorded the whole thing. He never moved aggressively. I got it on video too," the jogger added. "Your officer pulled his gun for no reason." Sergeant Torres looked from Mitchell to David to the growing crowd of witnesses. Her face was hard to read, but David saw something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or disappointment. Like this wasn't the first time she'd dealt with something like this. "Mitchell, holster your weapon," she said firmly. "Right now." "But Sergeant, that's an order." Mitchell hesitated for just a moment, then slowly lowered his gun and returned it to his holster. David's legs nearly gave out from relief. He kept his hands up, though, not trusting that this was really over. Sergeant Torres walked over to David, her approach careful and measured. "Sir, you can lower your hands." "Are you injured?" "No, ma'am," David said, finally lowering his arms. His shoulders ached from holding them up for so long. "But I'd like to know why I was stopped in the first place." "We're going to figure that out," she said. Then she turned to Mitchell. "What was the initial reason for the traffic stop?" Mitchell's confidence faltered. He was driving suspiciously. Suspiciously how? He was going slow. Looking around, like he was casing houses. "I was following the speed limit," David interjected. 28 in a 30 zone, and I was looking at Christmas decorations. That's all." Sergeant Torres glanced at the houses around them, their windows twinkling with holiday lights. Then she looked at David's car, noted the military uniform visible through the window, and her expression tightened. "Mitchell, go wait by your vehicle," she ordered. "Sergeant, I was just doing my job." "Now." Mitchell walked away, and David could see the anger radiating off him. The officer knew he'd been caught, and he didn't like it. Sergeant Torres turned back to David. "Sir, I apologize for what just happened. Can I see your license and registration?" David handed them over, his hand still shaking slightly. She examined them carefully, then looked at his military ID. "Lieutenant Cooper," she read aloud. "Fort Bragg. Thank you for your service." "Thank you, ma'am," David replied automatically, though the words felt hollow right now. She walked to his car and looked at the uniform, the medals, the scattered belongings from Mitchell's search. When she came back, her jaw was set in a hard line. "I'm going to need statements from all the witnesses," she announced to the crowd. Several people stepped forward, eager to tell what they'd seen. The older woman who'd been watching from the beginning was first. Her name was Mrs. Patricia Henderson, and she'd lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. "I saw the whole thing from my window," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "That young man did nothing wrong. Nothing. He was polite and respectful, and your officer treated him like a criminal from the moment he walked up to the car. The jogger, who introduced himself as Tom Rodriguez, was next. "I'm a defense attorney," he said, "and what I witnessed was textbook racial profiling followed by excessive force. That officer had no probable cause for the stop, no justification for the search, and absolutely no reason to draw his weapon." The woman who'd been recording from her porch came down with her phone. Her name was Jennifer Wu, and she was a paralegal. "I have the entire interaction on video," she said. "From the moment the officer ordered him out of the car until you arrived. The lieutenant never made any aggressive moves. He never reached for anything. The officer's claims are completely false." One by one, witnesses gave their statements. An elderly man who'd been walking his dog, a teenager who'd been coming home from basketball practice, a mother who'd been watching from her kitchen window while making dinner. All of them told the same story. David had done nothing wrong, and Officer Mitchell had escalated the situation without cause. While Sergeant Torres collected statements, David stood by his car, trying to process what had happened. He felt numb, disconnected from reality. He'd come so close to dying, and for what? For driving through a neighborhood? For existing while black? His phone buzzed again. He pulled it out and saw 15 missed calls from his fiancée, Rachel. His hands fumbled as he tried to call her back. "David! Oh my God, where are you? You were supposed to be here an hour ago." Her voice was frantic. "I'm okay," he said, though he wasn't sure that was true. "I got pulled over." "Pulled over? For what?" David looked at Officer Mitchell, who was sitting in his patrol car now, staring straight ahead. "I don't know, baby. I honestly don't know. Are you still there? Do you need me to come?" "No, there's another officer here now. She's handling it. But I'm going to be late for the talk. Really late. Maybe I should just cancel." "Don't you dare cancel," Rachel said firmly. "Those kids need to hear from you, especially after what just happened. You need to tell them about this." David wasn't sure he could. How do you tell a group of teenagers that the world isn't fair, that doing everything right still might not be enough, that the uniform and medals and honorable service might not matter when someone has already decided what you are? Sergeant Torres came back over, and David told Rachel he'd call her back. The sergeant's face was serious. "Lieutenant Cooper, I've collected statements from 8 witnesses. I've also reviewed the body camera footage from Officer Mitchell's uniform camera, and I'll be obtaining the dashboard camera footage as well. Based on what I've seen and heard, this stop was conducted improperly." "What happens now?" David asked. "I'm going to file a full report. Officer Mitchell will be placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. You have the right to file a formal complaint with our Internal Affairs Division, and I strongly encourage you to do so. You may also want to contact an attorney." David nodded slowly. Part of him wanted to just go home, forget this ever happened, and move on with his life. But he thought about all the people who didn't have witnesses, all the traffic stops that happened on empty roads without cameras, all the times officers like Mitchell got away with this because no one was watching. "I'll file the complaint," he said, "and I want copies of all the video footage." "You'll get them," Sergeant Torres promised. She handed him a card. "This has the case number and the information for our Internal Affairs Division. Again, I'm truly sorry this happened." She walked over to Mitchell's car and had a brief, intense conversation with him. David couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Mitchell's face turn red, saw him arguing. Finally, Sergeant Torres pointed firmly toward the road, and Mitchell started his car and drove away. Sergeant Torres came back one more time. "You're free to go, Lieutenant. Is there anything else you need from me right now?" David looked at his scattered belongings, his uniform lying on the hood, his gym clothes still on the ground. "Can you help me understand something? What did I do that made him stop me? Because I've been going over it in my head and I can't figure it out." Sergeant Torres met his eyes, and in that look, David saw that she understood. She understood the real reason. The reason that had nothing to do with traffic violations or suspicious behavior or matching descriptions. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said quietly, "and that's what makes this so terrible." David gathered his belongings while several neighbors helped pick up his things. Mrs. Henderson brought him a bottle of water. Tom Rodriguez gave him his business card and offered free legal assistance. Jennifer Wu sent him the video footage right there. As David finally got back in his car, his hands still trembling as he gripped the steering wheel, he realized something. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The video would spread. People would talk. And what happened next would determine whether any of this meant anything at all. David sat in his car for a full 5 minutes before he felt steady enough to drive. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white. He took deep breaths, trying to calm the adrenaline still flooding his system. Combat breathing, they called it in the military. 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds out. It had helped him stay focused during firefights overseas. Now he was using it on a suburban street in his own country. When he finally pulled away from the curb, he drove straight to the community center. He was almost 2 hours late, but he wasn't going to cancel. Rachel had been right. These kids needed to hear from him. Maybe now more than ever. The community center's parking lot was still half full when he arrived. Inside, he found about 30 teenagers still waiting, along with the program coordinator, an older black man named Mr. Wilson who'd served in Vietnam. "Lieutenant Cooper," Mr. Wilson said, relief flooding his face. "We were worried about you. Are you all right?" David realized he must look terrible. His clothes were disheveled from being searched. His face probably showed the stress he'd just endured. He tried to smile, but it didn't quite work. "I got detained," he said simply. "Can I still speak to them?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." David walked to the front of the room where the teenagers sat waiting. Some were on their phones. Others were talking quietly. A few looked up at him with curious expressions. These kids were from the neighborhood. Mixed backgrounds, different races, all of them trying to figure out their futures. He'd prepared a speech about leadership and discipline and the opportunities the military could provide. But standing there now looking at their young faces, he couldn't give that speech. Not after what just happened. "My name is Lieutenant David Cooper," he began, "and I need to be honest with you. I just had a gun pointed at me by a police officer less than an hour ago." The room went completely silent. Every phone was lowered. Every eye was on him. "I was driving here to meet you all, following every traffic law. I wasn't speeding. My car is registered and insured. Everything was legal, but I got pulled over anyway. And within 10 minutes, an officer had drawn his weapon on me while I stood there with my hands up, completely unarmed and complying with every order he gave." He saw several kids nodding. They understood. They'd lived it or knew someone who had. "I'm standing here in front of you because witnesses recorded what happened, because other people stood up and told the truth. Because a good sergeant arrived and did the right thing. But I almost didn't make it here at all, and that's something I need you to understand." One girl, maybe 16 years old, raised her hand. "Did you tell them you were in the Army?" "I did. I showed him my military ID. I told him about my service." It didn't matter to him. He'd already decided who I was based on what he saw. A boy in the back spoke up. "My brother got stopped 3 times last month. He wasn't doing nothing wrong either." "I believe you," David said, "and I'm sorry that happened to him." "I'm sorry it happens to any of us." Another hand went up. A younger kid, maybe 14. "Are you still going to be a soldier?" After what happened? It was a good question. David had asked himself the same thing during those terrifying moments with Mitchell's gun pointed at him. What was he fighting for? What was he protecting?
Yes, he answered.
"I'm still going to serve. Because the military taught me something important. It taught me that things don't change unless good people stand up and demand change. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to fight to make things better." He talked to them for another hour, abandoning his prepared remarks entirely. He spoke honestly about his experience, about the fear he'd felt, about the injustice of it. But he also talked about resilience, about using your voice, about the importance of witnesses and community and people who refuse to look away when something wrong is happening. When he finally finished, several kids came up to thank him. One girl told him her father had a similar experience and never talked about it. One boy said he wanted to join the military, but was scared of what he might face when he came home. David gave them all the same advice. Be excellent. Be undeniable. But also be prepared, be smart, and know your rights. Mr. Wilson walked him to his car. "That was powerful, son." Not the speech I expected, but the one they needed to hear. I didn't plan it, David admitted. The best truths are usually unplanned. David drove home in a daze. When he walked through the door of his apartment, Rachel was waiting. She took one look at him and immediately wrapped him in a hug. He held on to her and finally let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. The fear, the anger, the humiliation, the relief at being alive. I was so scared, he whispered into her hair. I know, baby, I know. They sat on the couch and he told her everything. Every detail. Every word. Every moment when he thought it might be over. Rachel listened, tears streaming down her face, holding his hand so tight it almost hurt. We need to do something, she said when he finished. This can't just disappear. Sergeant Torres said she's filing a report. I'm going to file a complaint with Internal Affairs. That's not enough. Rachel grabbed her laptop. People need to know about this. She was right, and David knew it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd gone through something similar. Every traffic stop that went too far. Every officer who abused their power without consequences. The next morning, David went to the police station and filed his formal complaint. He provided his statement, gave them permission to use all the witness videos, and requested copies of every piece of footage from the incident. The Internal Affairs investigator was professional, but non-committal. We take all complaints seriously, she said. The investigation will be thorough. David wanted to believe her, but he'd heard too many stories of investigations that went nowhere, of officers who got a slap on the wrist and went right back to work. That same day, Jennifer Wu, the paralegal who'd recorded the incident, posted her video on social media. She wrote a detailed description of what she'd witnessed and tagged several local news outlets and civil rights organizations. The video spread faster than anyone expected. By that evening, it had been viewed 50,000 times. By the next morning, it had hit 1 million. News outlets picked it up. Local stations ran the story. National networks started calling. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Civil rights lawyers offered to represent him for free. Community organizers wanted him to speak at rallies. It was overwhelming. But what really got people's attention was when someone started digging into Officer Mitchell's background. A journalist named Kevin Park from the local newspaper filed public records requests and found something troubling. This wasn't Mitchell's first complaint. Over the past 6 years, Mitchell had been the subject of 14 formal complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, unprofessional conduct, inappropriate use of authority. The complaints came from Black citizens, Latino citizens, Asian citizens, a clear pattern that the department had apparently ignored. 3 of those complaints had been sustained, meaning the department found them credible. Mitchell had received written reprimands. He'd been sent to additional training, but he'd never been suspended, never seriously disciplined, and he'd certainly never been fired. The newspaper ran a front-page story. Problem officer remained on force despite multiple complaints. They included details from several cases, including one where Mitchell had been accused of planting evidence on a teenager. That case had been dismissed, but the similarities to David's situation were striking. Social media exploded with anger. People demanded accountability. They wanted to know why Mitchell had been allowed to continue working despite his record. They wanted to know how many other officers like him were still on the force. Bomea. Police department issued a statement saying the incident was under investigation and that they took all allegations of misconduct seriously. It was the kind of vague, non-committal response that usually made controversies fade away, but this time was different. This time there was video evidence from multiple angles. This time there were 8 credible witnesses. This time the victim was a decorated military officer who'd done everything right. And this time people weren't going to let it go. A protest was organized for that weekend. Not a violent demonstration, but a peaceful gathering calling for accountability and reform. The organizers asked David if he would speak. He wasn't sure he wanted to become the face of this movement, but Rachel encouraged him. You have a platform now, she said. Use it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who doesn't have a voice. The protest drew over 2,000 people. They marched through downtown, carrying signs that read, "Badge doesn't mean above the law," and "Protect and serve everyone," and "Justice for Lieutenant Cooper." David stood on the steps of City Hall and told his story again. This time to a crowd of strangers who'd come out to support him. He talked about serving his country overseas only to be threatened at gunpoint on American soil. He talked about the other victims of Officer Mitchell's abuse. He talked about the need for real accountability. "I don't want revenge," he told the crowd. "I want change. I want a system where officers who abuse their power face real consequences. I want training that teaches de-escalation instead of escalation. I want a police force that protects all citizens equally, regardless of the color of their skin." The crowd cheered. News cameras captured it all. And somewhere in the police department, people were starting to realize that this situation wasn't going away. They were going to have to do something they'd avoided for 6 years. They were going to have to hold Officer Mitchell accountable. The pressure kept building. What started as one viral video became a national conversation about police accountability and racial profiling. News outlets across the country covered the story. Civil rights organizations got involved. Even some politicians started weighing in, calling for reform. David tried to go back to his normal life, but normal didn't exist anymore. He couldn't walk into a store without being recognized. People stopped him on the street to thank him for speaking out. Others shared their own stories of being pulled over for no reason, of being treated like criminals when they'd done nothing wrong. 2 weeks after the incident, the police department finally made an announcement. The chief of police held a press conference, looking uncomfortable as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. After a thorough internal investigation, the chief began, reading from a prepared statement. "We have determined that Officer Derek Mitchell violated several department policies during his interaction with Lieutenant David Cooper. Officer Mitchell used excessive force, failed to establish probable cause for the traffic stop, and made false statements in his initial report." The room erupted with questions, but the chief held up his hand for silence. Effective immediately, Officer Mitchell has been terminated from the Pinewood Heights Police Department. Additionally, we are referring this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. David watched the press conference from his apartment, Rachel sitting beside him. When the chief announced Mitchell's termination, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, vindication, but also something heavier. Sadness that it had taken national attention and public outrage to get this result. Anger that 14 previous complaints hadn't been enough. "It's a start," Rachel said, squeezing his hand. "Just a start," David agreed. The district attorney moved quickly, probably aware that the whole country was watching. Within a month, Officer Mitchell was indicted on charges of assault, official misconduct, and deprivation of civil rights. He pleaded not guilty, and his lawyer made the rounds on television claiming Mitchell had been following his training and feared for his life. But the evidence was too strong. 8 witnesses, multiple videos from different angles, body camera footage that contradicted Mitchell's official report. Even other officers came forward to say they'd witnessed Mitchell's inappropriate behavior, but had been afraid to report it. The trial lasted 2 weeks. David had to testify, reliving that night in front of a courtroom full of strangers. He described the fear he'd felt with that gun pointed at his chest. He explained how he'd complied with every order, kept his hands visible, announced every movement. He talked about wearing his country's uniform with pride, only to have an officer tell him it was probably stolen. Mitchell's defense attorney tried to paint David as threatening, suggesting that his military training made him dangerous. The prosecutor shut that down immediately. "Lieutenant Cooper's military training is exactly why he survived this encounter," the prosecutor argued. "He knew how to stay calm under pressure. He knew how to follow orders even when those orders were unjust. His training kept him alive when Officer Mitchell was looking for any excuse to use deadly force." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all charges. When the verdict was read, David felt Rachel's hand grip his. In the courtroom, several people cried. Mitchell sat stone-faced, but David saw his hands shaking. The man who'd held so much power that night, who'd made David fear for his life, now faced his own reckoning. Mitchell was sentenced to 3 years in prison, though some people thought it should have been longer. David didn't attend the sentencing. He'd said what he needed to say. Now he wanted to focus on making sure something good came from this nightmare. The police department, under intense scrutiny, implemented major reforms. They created a citizen oversight board with real power to investigate complaints. They required all officers to complete extensive de-escalation and implicit bias training. They updated their use of force policies and made disciplinary records more transparent. Most importantly, they established a system where officers with multiple sustained complaints faced automatic review and possible termination. No more second chances for those who repeatedly violated people's rights. David became an advocate for police reform, not because he wanted to, but because he felt he had to. He spoke at community forums and police academies. He shared his story with anyone who would listen. He worked with organizations trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities of color. Some police officers thanked him. Good cops who were tired of working alongside bad ones who wanted higher standards and better accountability. They told him that officers like Mitchell made their jobs harder and more dangerous. But David also received hate mail. Anonymous messages calling him a troublemaker and worse. People accused him of being anti-police, of exaggerating what happened, of playing the victim. He learned to ignore it, focusing instead on the positive changes happening. 6 months after the incident, David was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. Standing in front of hundreds of police officers and administrators, he felt the weight of the moment. "I don't hate police officers," he told them. "I hate what happened to me. But I understand that most of you put on that uniform every day wanting to serve your communities honorably. The problem is that a few bad officers make everyone look bad. And when departments protect those bad officers instead of removing them, they lose the trust of the people they're supposed to serve." He talked about Sergeant Torres, who'd done the right thing when she arrived at that scene, about the witnesses who'd refused to look away, about the importance of accountability and rebuilding trust. "Change is hard," he said, "but it's necessary, not just for people who look like me, but for all citizens. And honestly, for good officers too. Because when you remove the officers who abuse their power, the ones who do the job right can finally be seen for who they really are." The response was mixed, but several officers approached him afterward to share their own concerns about accountability in their departments. Some asked for advice on how to report misconduct without facing retaliation. David connected them with advocacy organizations and lawyers who could help. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal. David went back to his base, back to his duties, but he was different now. He'd always known racism existed, had experienced it before in smaller ways, but having a gun pointed at him for no reason had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. He struggled with it sometimes. Rachel noticed the way he tensed up when he saw police cars, the nightmares that woke him up gasping. She encouraged him to talk to a therapist at the VA, and he finally agreed. It helped to process the trauma with someone who understood. A year after the incident, the city invited David to a ceremony. They were dedicating a new community policing initiative in his name. The Cooper Initiative focused on building relationships between officers and neighborhoods, emphasizing respect and understanding over aggressive enforcement. David stood on the stage at City Hall, looking out at a crowd that included police officers, community members, and the teenagers he'd spoken to that night after his traumatic stop. Some of those kids were in the audience now, and a few had even joined programs that would lead them toward careers in law enforcement or social work. Mrs. Henderson was there, the elderly woman who'd watched from her window and refused to look away. Tom Rodriguez, the attorney who'd witnessed everything. Jennifer Wu, whose video had sparked the national conversation. All the people who'd stood up when it mattered. "This initiative is named after me," David said, "but it represents something much bigger than one person's experience. It represents a commitment to change, a promise that we can do better, that we will do better." He talked about the progress that had been made, the officers who'd been held accountable, the policies that had been changed, the training that was now mandatory, but he also acknowledged how much work remained. "Real change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "It happens through consistent effort, through people refusing to accept injustice, through communities demanding accountability. What happened to me was wrong, but what we've built from it, what we continue to build, that's something worth fighting for." After the ceremony, one of the teenagers from that community center talk approached him. The boy who'd asked if David would still serve after what happened. "I've been thinking about joining the army," the kid said, "because of you. Because you showed us that you can stand up for what's right even when it's hard." David felt tears prick his eyes. This was why it mattered. Not the awards or recognition. Not even the justice that had been served. It was about inspiring the next generation to believe in something better, to demand something better. That night, David sat with Rachel on their balcony, looking out at the city lights. His uniform hung in the closet, ready for when he returned to duty. The medals he'd earned overseas sat in their case, but the thing he was most proud of wasn't any military accomplishment. It was that he'd taken the worst moment of his life and used it to create change. That he'd faced down injustice and refused to be silent. That his story had helped shift the conversation, even if just a little, toward accountability and reform. "You okay?" Rachel asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. "Yeah," David said, and he meant it. "I think I finally am." He would never forget that December night, the cold air, the flashing lights, the gun pointed at his chest. But he also wouldn't let it define him. He'd survived. He'd spoken out. He'd made a difference. And in a world that sometimes felt impossibly broken, that had to be enough.